night settles differently when the world finally grows quiet. There's a softness to the darkness that feels harmless at first, like a heavy blanket laid across the city, the countryside, every road and window and rooftop. Most people fall asleep believing nothing stirs after that hour, that silence means safety and darkness means rest. But if you've ever been awake deep into the night, you know the stillness has layers, small creaks inside the walls, the hum of distant traffic, or the faint rustle of something shifting just out of view. It's in those quiet, forgotten corners of the night that the mind begins to notice things it never pays attention to during the day. The hours after midnight carry a different weight, as if the world is thinning and the familiar routines of life are drifting farther away. Houses breathe, floors settle, and long hallways feel a little longer than they should. Most of the people in these stories were like any of us finishing a long evening, getting ready for bed, trying to unwind from the noise of the day. Nothing about their nights was unusual at first, nothing that hinted at the moment everything shifted. But somewhere between exhaustion and sleep, something touched their world just lightly enough that they almost missed it. Sometimes it was a sound against a window, a soft tapping on old wood, or a faint knock that blended into the night so neatly that they wondered if it came from inside their dreams. Other times it was the sense that someone or something was awake with them, lingering just beyond the glow of the hallway light. These weren't people looking for fear, and none of them imagined they would remember that hour for the rest of their lives. Yet each one heard the same thing at the same time across different towns, different homes, and different sleeping streets. All of them learned that 3 a.m. has its own kind of visitor. So if you're listening in a dark room or a quiet house, let the night settle around you for a moment. Let the silence feel familiar, the way it always does right before something small breaks through. These stories come from ordinary people who heard a knock they couldn't explain, a sound that arrived when the world should have been asleep. And tonight, we begin with the first one. I didn't grow up thinking much about the patterns people use when they knock. Most of my memories of it come from childhood. My dad had this soft, three-beat rhythm he'd tap on my bedroom door before coming in, a gentle habit I never questioned. Over the years, I forgot about it completely. Life got noisy, adulthood blurred everything, and knocking became the kind of everyday sound you tune out. I hadn't thought about that rhythm for decades, not until the night someone brought it back in a way that felt too close to be coincidence. Even now, when I think about that moment, I remember the stillness of my living room first. How warm the lamps looked, how the television hummed softly in the background, and how I felt more tired than I wanted to admit. Everything was normal, the kind of quiet night where nothing should stand out. It was around 3 a.m. when the knock came. I didn't even catch it clearly at first. It sounded faint, almost distant, like someone tapping on a wall rather than a door. I was half asleep on the couch, drifting in that in-between space where sounds blur into dreams. But the second time it came, clearer and a little firmer, it pulled me fully awake. I remember sitting up, feeling that mild annoyance that comes when something disturbs your sleep, yet there was also a strange hesitation I couldn't explain. The knock had a softness to it, not urgent, not threatening, but familiar. I tried to brush that thought away, thinking maybe my mind was forcing patterns onto nothing. Still, something inside me felt off. I listened harder, holding my breath without meaning to. Then it came again, three gentle taps in that exact rhythm I hadn't heard since I was a kid. Tap, tap, tap. I froze, not out of sudden fear, but from a deep, slow realization that crept through my chest. My father had passed away years before, and no one else alive knew that rhythm. I told myself it was probably a coincidence, some random pattern knock that resembled something from memory. But the longer I sat there, the more impossible that explanation felt. Who knocks like that at 3 a.m.? Who knocks gently at all at that hour? I noticed the room felt colder than before and the shadows against the walls seemed heavier, as if the house itself was holding its breath with me. I told myself I should check the door, but I didn't move right away. My body felt stuck between logic and something older, something primal. Eventually, I stood up, more out of compulsion than courage. Each step toward the front door felt slow, like wadding through thick air. I kept listening, expecting the knock to come again, but everything had gone quiet. That silence was almost worse. It felt intentional, like whoever was out there was waiting for me to get closer. When I finally reached the door, I hesitated with my hand hovering over the peephole. I don't know why it felt so hard to look. Maybe it was the fear of seeing nothing, or maybe the fear of seeing something standing too close. I leaned in anyway, forcing myself to check. The porch was empty. The yellow glow of the streetlight fell across the steps, and there wasn't a hint of movement, just stillness, deep and uncomplicated. I almost convinced myself I imagined the whole thing. I had just started turning away when the knock sounded again, but this time it came from the back door, same rhythm, same gentle patience. The jolt of that moment went through me so quickly that I can still feel it when I think about it. There was no way a person could move from the front to the back of the house that fast without making a sound. And the knock, it wasn't frantic or out of breath. It was steady, as though whoever was doing it had been standing there the whole time, waiting for me to look away. I didn't go to the back door. I stood in the hallway, listening, trying to make sense of what was happening. The air felt heavier back there, colder, like stepping too close would change something I couldn't undo. I kept hoping it would stop, but the knocks continued with that same patience, never loud, never forceful, just persistent. When the knocking finally stopped, the silence that followed felt unnatural. I waited for footsteps or the creak of boards outside or anything that sounded human, but there was nothing. Not even the usual night sounds, no cars, no wind, no dogs barking in the distance. I tried turning on more lights, but even that didn't help shake the feeling that someone had been standing inches away from my walls just moments ago. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in the living room with every lamp on, listening to the house breathe in that quiet, uneasy way old places do when the world outside is still awake. The next morning, I checked the front and back porches. No footprints, no signs of anyone walking through the dew-covered grass. The ground was completely undisturbed, but on the front door frame near the bottom corner, I found three faint marks, shallow, spaced evenly, like something had tapped there over and over again. They weren't scratches or dents, they looked more like impressions pressed into the wood by something that didn't need force. I told myself it could have been anything, wear and tear. Old damage I'd never noticed. That's what I wanted to believe. But the rhythm, I can't explain the rhythm. I never told anyone about that knock growing up. It wasn't something I shared with friends or mentioned in stories. It was just a family habit, a small piece of my childhood tucked away with everything else. And that night, whoever, whatever knocked on my doors seemed to know it perfectly. Not rushed, not wrong, not by chance. Perfectly. Every time I think back, I try telling myself I misheard it. That fatigue and memory played a trick on me. But some nights when the house gets too quiet and the air feels a little too still, I find myself listening without meaning to. And on those nights when the clock slides past 3 a.m., I sometimes hear it again. Soft, patient, tap, tap, tap. As if something out there is reminding me it still remembers my name. I moved into that apartment building during a strange season of my life, when everything felt slightly out of place but not in a way I could put into words. The building itself was old but comfortable, the kind of place that looked tired in daylight and strangely peaceful at night. I remember how the hallway always smelled faintly of paint and warm dust, and how the lights hummed just enough to fill the silence without breaking it. The first few nights I lived there, I slept easily, partly because I was exhausted and partly because the building had its own rhythm, doors shutting softly, pipes clicking, someone walking upstairs just enough to remind me I wasn't alone. There was nothing unusual about any of it. Nothing that hinted at what would eventually shake the sense of safety I had built around those sounds. It started one night around 3 a.m. when a soft knock echoed faintly from somewhere out in the hallway. At first, I barely reacted. I was half asleep and assumed it was someone returning late or maybe visiting a neighbor. Old buildings pass sound oddly. What happens on the far side can feel like it's happening right outside your door. But the knock came again, slower this time and spaced in a way that didn't feel like normal impatient tapping. It was the kind of knock someone uses when they don't want to disturb anyone but still want to be heard. I lay there listening, waiting for footsteps or voices to follow, but the hallway remained quiet. There was something about that silence, deep and complete, that made the knock feel heavier than it should. A minute later, the knock came again, and this time it was definitely at my door. I sat up in bed, feeling that familiar mix of caution and curiosity that happens when you're half awake. I didn't feel scared yet, just confused. No one knew me well enough in the building to visit at that hour, and I hadn't ordered anything. I waited, thinking maybe someone had the wrong unit. But the knock continued, soft and patient, always the same 3 taps as if the person on the other side knew exactly how to get my attention without causing panic. What bothered me most was how deliberate it sounded. There was no frustration in it, no urgency, just waiting. And for some reason, that made it worse. I finally got out of bed and padded softly toward the door, careful not to make noise on the old wooden floor. Every few steps, the knocking stopped, then resumed the second I paused, almost like whoever was there could sense my movements from the other side. The realization made my stomach tighten. It was too precise to ignore. I stood in front of the door then, not touching it, just listening. The knocks weren't forceful, they were almost gentle, but the space between each tap felt longer, stretched thin with intention. I thought about speaking, asking if someone needed help, but something in the back of my mind kept me quiet. I didn't want whoever was out there to know I was standing just inches away from them. After a long moment, I leaned toward the peephole and took a slow breath before looking. The hallway was empty. Just the dim yellow light reflecting off the chipped tile floor, the same still air, the same hum from the old ceiling fixture. No shadows moving, no signs of anyone walking away. Nothing. Yet as I pulled back, another knock sounded, this time not from the door but from the wall beside it. 3 soft taps, right at ear level, as if someone was standing impossibly close to the thin plaster. I jerked back in surprise, heart suddenly racing. No one could stand in that spot, there wasn't room. The wall led directly to the maintenance shaft, a long, narrow space only accessible from the basement. I stepped away from the door, feeling a cold weight spreading through my chest. I tried to convince myself the sound had traveled weirdly, that old buildings did strange things with acoustics. But the knock came again, perfectly placed like a reply to my denial. I backed into the living room and turned on a lamp, hoping the light would settle me. It didn't. The apartment felt too bright now, too exposed, like someone could see inside even though the blinds were drawn. The knocking didn't continue, but the silence that followed felt worse, stretching thin across the walls until every small sound made me flinch. I barely slept after that, drifting in and out of shallow dreams until the sun finally came up. The hallway looked normal in daylight, too normal in fact, and for a few hours I managed to convince myself that fatigue had twisted ordinary sounds into something eerie. Eventually, curiosity pushed me to check the wall outside my apartment. Nothing stood out at first, but then I noticed faint smudges low on the wall, small and oddly shaped, like dusty fingerprints dragged across the paint. They were positioned near where the knocks had come from inside, and the height of them made my skin crawl. They were too low for an adult, too small to belong to anyone in the building I'd seen so far. I cleaned the smudges, telling myself it had to be from the maintenance crew or maybe a neighbor's kid passing through earlier. But over the next few nights, I found myself listening for sounds I didn't want to hear. Every time the building settled or a door shut far away, I'd brace myself for that same pattern, three soft taps, patient and knowing. Sometimes I'd think I heard them under the hum of the hallway light, faint enough that I questioned my own senses. Other times I was certain I heard them, so clear that I'd freeze mid-step and hold my breath. One night, weeks later, I woke up again around 3 a.m., not because of a knock, but because of a feeling, the sense that something was standing on the other side of my door in complete stillness. I didn't go check. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the building breathe around me. Nothing happened, no footsteps, no tapping, just a quiet pressure against the air like a presence waiting without needing to announce itself. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I still live in that apartment, though I've thought about leaving more than once. People talk about intuition like it's some vague, unreliable thing, but I've learned that the body knows when something isn't right long before the mind catches up. I haven't heard the knock in a while, but sometimes when I walk down the hallway late at night, I feel that same gentle pressure in the air, the sense that something is always a step behind me. And every so often, when I pass the maintenance shaft door, I swear I hear the faintest sound from inside, a soft three-tap rhythm, patient as ever, reminding me the visitor in the hallway never really left. I rented the cabin because I needed silence, the kind of silence you can't find in a city no matter how late it gets. It was early autumn, and the woods were still warm in the afternoons but cool enough at night that every sound seemed to carry farther. The place wasn't fancy, just an old one-bedroom cabin tucked into a clearing a few miles off a gravel road, the kind of structure built more for hunters than vacationers. Inside, everything smelled faintly of pine and old smoke, the sort of scent that sinks into wood over decades. I remember lighting a small lamp on the table, feeling its glow settle into the room gently, leaving the corners soft and shadowed. The first evening passed quietly, dinner, a book I barely touched, and the comforting creak of the floorboards adjusting to the night. It felt peaceful, almost lulling, exactly what I had hoped for. I went to bed earlier than usual, partly because the dark came quickly in the woods and partly because silence like that makes you more aware of how tired you are. The cabin had no heavy curtains, just thin fabric that let in the pale glow of moonlight. I could see the outline of the trees through them, swaying slightly with the breeze. I don't know when I fell asleep exactly, but I remember waking up to stillness so complete it felt like the world had stopped breathing. And then softly at first came a single knock at the front door. It was so quiet and so out of place that for a moment I thought I had dreamed it. But the second knock followed, clearer, firmer, and this time I sat up completely awake, pulse suddenly louder in my ears than anything outside. I told myself it was probably an animal brushing against the wood. Deer wandered close, I'd been told, and sometimes raccoons would explore porches looking for scraps, but something about the knock didn't match that explanation. It had rhythm, placement, a human quality. I listened hard, waiting for footsteps or voices, but the night remained unnervingly calm. The air coming in through the cracked window felt colder than before, and I noticed I was holding my breath without realizing it. I turned on the lamp, watched the room fill with warm light, and felt that subtle shift in the atmosphere, the kind that happens when you sense something is near even when you can't see it. The knock didn't continue, which somehow made it worse. It just lingered in the air like an unfinished thought. I finally got up and walked toward the front of the cabin. The wood floor felt cool under my bare feet, and every creak seemed loud enough to announce my movement to whatever was outside. I stood a few feet from the door listening, nothing. Not a shuffle, not a branch snapping, not the sound of retreating steps, just silence stretching across the entire clearing. I didn't look through the peephole, partly out of fear and partly because I knew I wouldn't see much in the darkness anyway. Is after a long moment of waiting, I turned to go back to bed, and that's when the knock came again, not from the front door but from the back entrance on the opposite side of the cabin. Three soft taps, spaced apart just enough to feel intentional. A chill swept through me hard enough that I had to steady myself on the wall. I tried to convince myself I had misheard the direction, but the knocks repeated undeniably from the back. The only way to reach that door was to walk around the entire cabin, and yet I hadn't heard a single footstep in the dry leaves or gravel outside. The cabin wasn't large, but the distance between the two doors was wide enough that even a careful person would have made noise. But the night remained unnaturally quiet, as if sound had been swallowed by something bigger than the forest. I stayed frozen in place for several seconds, listening for anything, breathing, dragging movement, but the air felt still and heavy. I moved slowly toward the back of the cabin, each step feeling measured and reluctant. The back door had no window, just a thin layer of wood separating me from whoever stood outside. I pressed my hand lightly against the door. The wood felt cold, almost damp, and I could swear I felt the faintest vibration, like someone resting their fingers on the other side. Before I could pull away, another knock came, softer this time, as though it were responding to my presence. As my heart hammered so hard I thought it might echo, I whispered something weak, "Who's there?" But my voice felt too thin to matter. No answer followed. Just a long, stretching silence that felt far more intentional than the knock. I backed away from the door, step by step, until I reached the middle of the cabin again. I wanted to call anyone, but my phone was in the bedroom, and suddenly that distance felt far too large. I debated turning on every light, but something about the situation made me hesitate, as though brightening the cabin would expose me more than it would help. Instead, I grabbed the lamp from the table and held it close like a makeshift shield. It illuminated only a small sphere around me, leaving the corners of the room to pulse and shift in the dimness. I could feel the cabin creaking slightly, the wood expanding and contracting, but underneath those natural sounds was something else, a quiet listening, as if the walls themselves were aware of the knock and waiting for the next one. When nothing happened for several minutes, I began to think maybe it was over. Maybe it had been a prank or an animal behaving strangely. I sat on the edge of the couch, trying to calm my breathing, telling myself I was overreacting. Then, just as I began to believe my own reassurance, a new sound broke through the silence. Not a knock this time, but a slow, dragging scrape traveling along the outer wall of the cabin. It moved steadily, following the shape of the structure, making a full circle around it at an impossibly consistent pace. It wasn't hurried or clumsy, it was controlled, and it never paused, not even for a moment. The sound finally faded when it circled back to the front door. I didn't dare move. I sat there, gripping the lamp, feeling like if I breathed too loudly something outside would notice. I waited for another knock, another scrape, anything, but the night fell silent again. Not even the wind stirred. Eventually, dawn crept in slowly through the curtains, turning the cabin's rough wood a muted gray. Only then did I stand and walk to the front door. I opened it with trembling hands and stepped outside into the crisp morning air. That's when I saw them, footprints in the damp earth surrounding the cabin. They formed a complete ring, perfectly spaced, as if someone had walked around the cabin multiple times during the night. But what made my stomach twist was the direction. Every single print faced inward toward the cabin, none walking away, none leading up from the trees, just a circle of impressions pressed into the earth, all pointing directly at me. I packed my things quickly, leaving the cabin before the sun fully rose. I didn't report it. I didn't tell the owners. I told myself I just needed time and distance. But even now, long after that night, I still think about the knock, the patience of it, the precision, the quiet certainty that something stood outside in the darkness, watching me from every angle. And sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had opened the door, whether the night would have stayed endless, and whether I would have ever come back out of it. I checked into the hotel because it was cheaper to stay overnight than drive home after a long, late meeting. It wasn't a bad place, just older, tucked off the highway, with carpet that had probably been replaced too many times and wallpaper that always seemed a little too yellow. Room 312 was at the end of a quiet hallway, the kind where your footsteps echo softly even when you try to walk lightly. I remember thinking how peaceful it felt when I first set my bags down, how the hum of the air conditioner filled the space in a gentle, steady rhythm. The room smelled faintly of detergent and something older beneath it, but not unpleasant. I turned on the bedside lamp, let its warm glow push back the emptiness of the room, and felt the exhaustion settle deep in my shoulders. Nothing about that first hour suggested anything unusual. If anything, I felt safer there than I had expected. I fell asleep quickly, the kind of sleep that comes from pure mental fatigue. It must have been around 3 a.m. when I woke up, not because of a nightmare or sudden movement, but because of a sound so soft it almost blended into the air conditioner. Three gentle knocks, barely audible, as though someone didn't want to disturb anyone else nearby. I lay there for a moment, trying to understand if I'd imagined it, but then it came again, a little clearer this time. The knock wasn't on the door to the hallway. It was coming from the connecting door, the narrow, locked door that linked room 312 to the room beside it. At first, I wasn't concerned. I figured someone must have gotten confused about which way the rooms connected. But the knocking felt wrong. It wasn't tentative the way confused hotel guests usually are. It was controlled, almost polite. I cleared my throat and said softly, "Wrong room," expecting the knocking to stop immediately. It didn't. Instead, the next set of knocks came quicker and slightly louder, as if whoever was on the other side had heard me but didn't care about the correction. A prickle of unease crawled along my arms. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, trying to shake off the fog of sleep. That was when I noticed something else. The light seeping under the connecting door wasn't steady. It seemed to flicker slightly, as though the lamp on the other side was moving or being blocked by someone packing. I leaned forward, watching the faint change in brightness, and felt the strangeness settle deeper. Why would someone be packing in a hotel room at this hour? And why knock so gently when the walls were thin enough to hear someone breathing? The knocking paused, and for a moment I hoped the person had gone back to bed. But then came a much softer sound, a delicate series of clicks, the doorknob turning slowly from the other side. It didn't rattle, it didn't jerk. It rotated with unsettling care, like someone was testing the lock rather than trying to open it outright. I froze completely, my breath held tight in my chest. The knob turned just enough to be undeniable, then reversed just as slowly, like fingers releasing it 1 millimeter at a time. The door between our rooms was thin, the kind of flimsy interior door that felt like it might give if someone pushed hard enough. I moved quietly back onto the bed, listening as the knob clicked again, a little faster now, a little more deliberately, not desperate, just insistent. After nearly a minute of this, I reached for my phone and called the front desk. The clerk sounded half asleep, but when I told him someone was in the adjoining room trying to get through the locked door, his voice sharpened. He said room 313, the room connected to mine, was unoccupied. No one had checked in. No one should be there. I felt my stomach drop as the doorknob made another slow rotation, as though whoever was behind it heard me talking and wanted me to know they weren't leaving. The clerk promised to send security up, but even with that reassurance, the air in the room felt heavier, thick with the kind of fear that doesn't need loud noises to grow. The knob stopped turning suddenly. Silence flooded the space, so complete it felt unnatural. I sat rigid on the bed, listening to the hum of the air conditioner and the faint buzz of the hallway lights beyond my main door. Minutes passed, slow, stretching minutes, until I finally heard movement outside. Not in the hallway, but inside the wall where the connecting door frame settled. A soft scraping, like fingernails brushing lightly along the wood. It traveled upward, then downward, as if the person on the other side were tracing the outline of the door, exploring every edge of it. I wanted to tell myself it was a mouse or settling noise, but the pattern was too purposeful. The scraping paused directly at ear level, and I felt a pressure there, as if someone pressed their hand flat against the door from the other side. Security knocked at my main door a few minutes later, loud enough to make me jump. I opened it immediately, grateful to see two employees and a flashlight beam cutting through the hallway's dimness. They checked room 313 using a master key. I stood in the hallway watching as they pushed open the adjoining door from the other room. No lights were on, no luggage, no signs of anyone having entered. But on the connecting door, the same one I had listened to for nearly half an hour, there were faint marks near the edge. Long, narrow scratch-like impressions, too shallow to be damage but too intentional to ignore. One of the guards brushed his thumb across them and frowned but didn't say anything. They chalked it up to old paint, apologized, and left me there in the hallway with the silent door. I didn't sleep after that. I turned on every light in the room and sat with my back against the far wall, watching the connecting door as though expecting it to breathe. Nothing else happened that night. No knocks, no scraping, no flickering shadows beneath the door. But the quiet felt loaded, like the absence of movement was its own kind of presence. When morning finally came, the hallway felt too bright, too empty, as if the night's events had been swallowed by daylight. I checked out without mentioning anything more to the staff. But the memory stayed with me, growing sharper instead of fading. What bothers me most isn't the knocking or even the turning doorknob. It's the scraping along the frame, that slow exploration of every edge. It felt less like someone trying to get in and more like someone trying to find a way out. And I've always wondered, ever since that night, whether room 313 was truly empty. Or whether something that shouldn't have been there was simply waiting for a moment when the hallway was silent and the lights were off, moving quietly where no one bothered to look. I grew up in a house that always felt a little too quiet at night. It wasn't haunted-looking or anything dramatic like that, just an old two-story place with soft floors and wide hallways that swallowed sound more than they reflected it. When I was younger, I used to fall asleep listening to the hum of the ceiling fan and the distant noise of my parents watching TV downstairs. But as I got older, and especially in my teenage years, I started noticing how different the house felt after everyone went to bed. The air got heavier, the silence deeper. It was the kind of quiet that made you hear things you wouldn't normally catch, the small pops of wood expanding, the faint creak of pipes shifting, and sometimes a soft, almost rhythmic tapping that drifted through the floorboards when the rest of the world had gone still. At first, I didn't think much of it. Old houses make noise. That's what I told myself. The first time it truly registered was on a school night when I stayed up too late doing homework. My room was on the second floor, right above the old dining room. The light from my desk lamp pooled across my textbooks, and the house felt unusually calm, as if it were settling more deeply into the night than usual. That's when I heard it, three faint taps from directly beneath the floor. They were so soft they almost blended into the natural settling of the house, but they had timing intention. Tap, tap, tap. I paused, listening. Nothing followed, so I let it go and went back to work. But a few minutes later, the tapping came again, this time slightly closer to where my chair was pressed against the wooden boards. I remember straightening slowly, realizing the sound wasn't random creaking. It was too rhythmic, too patient, too much like someone lightly knocking from under the floorboards. I leaned down and pressed my ear to the ground, half embarrassed even though no one could see me. The wood felt cool and the faint smell of dust drifted up, but for a long moment I heard nothing. Then, just as I pulled back, another set of taps came, this time faintly traveling from one side of the room toward the center. I jerked upright, my breath catching. I tried to rationalize it as plumbing, maybe an animal under the house, or even the wind pushing against something loose. All of those ideas made sense if the sound had been scattered or irregular, but this wasn't that. This felt like someone quietly moving beneath the boards, following a path I couldn't see. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want to sound paranoid. But that night, I slept with my light on for the first time in years. Over the next few weeks, the tapping returned, never loud, never aggressive, always soft, always around the same late hour when the house had gone completely still. The pattern changed slightly each time. Sometimes it sounded near the corner of the room, sometimes right under my bed, sometimes faint and far off like the tapping was somewhere in the walls instead of beneath the floor. I convinced myself it had to be pipes, or maybe an animal got stuck in the crawl space. As every explanation I came up with worked until I thought about the timing. The taps only happened between 2 and 3 in the morning, never earlier, never later, and always in sets like someone knocking politely to see if I was awake. One night the tapping started earlier than usual, around 1:45 a.m., just as I was drifting towards sleep. At first I tried to ignore it, rolling onto my side and pulling the blanket up to my chin. But then I heard something I still struggled to explain. The tapping paused, and in its place came a soft dragging sound like fingertips brushing slowly along the underside of the floorboards. It moved with a steady pace, circling beneath me in a way no animal could manage. I sat up immediately, heart pounding, listening so hard my ears began to ache. The dragging continued for several seconds, then stopped directly under the center of my bed. The silence that followed was so heavy I could hear my own breathing bouncing off the walls. I hesitated for a long time before leaning over the edge of the mattress to look at the floor. I don't know what I expected to see, maybe nothing, maybe a shadow that didn't belong, but the room looked exactly the same. Just the dark wooden boards and the faint glow of my lamp stretching out across the space. And then from underneath my bed I heard it, a single, clear knock. It was so close it felt like it came from inside the mattress. I scrambled back against the headboard, my throat tight. The air in the room felt colder, as if something had shifted in the walls. I wanted to run out into the hallway, but the idea of stepping onto the floor terrified me. I sat frozen for at least 10 minutes, not moving, barely breathing, waiting for the sound to come again. It didn't, not that night. But the next morning, I checked the crawlspace entrance in the laundry room with a flashlight, expecting to see signs of an animal, scratch marks, droppings, anything. The dust was untouched. The floor beneath the boards was smooth, undisturbed, and far too shallow for a person to fit. The space simply didn't allow for movement, not the kind I'd been hearing. I stood there for a long time, the cold air in the crawlspace brushing against my face, realizing there was nothing down there that could make those sounds. At least nothing physical. I shut the panel and didn't mention it to anyone in my family. But the tapping continued over the years. Not every night, not consistently. It would vanish for weeks and then return unexpectedly, always with that same measured rhythm. As I got older, I moved into a different room, one on the opposite side of the house, farther from the dining room floor. I thought that would help. For a while it did. But one night, after I'd finally relaxed into the new space, I woke to a familiar sound. Tappy, tap, tap. It came from beneath the floorboards of the new room, as if whatever had been underneath me all those years had simply followed. Now I'm an adult living far from that old house, but sometimes, especially on nights when the world feels too quiet, I think back to those sounds. I wonder whether the knocking was meant to get my attention or whether it was simply tracing the space I inhabited, mirroring my movement through that home. I never heard footsteps, never saw anything out of place, never felt a presence in the room. But the tapping, it had intention. It had patience. And sometimes, when I wake unexpectedly in the middle of the night for no obvious reason, I lay still and listen. Because every so often, even now, I swear I hear the faintest echo beneath my bed, a soft, distant tap, as if something that lived under those floorboards long ago is still trying to find me. I live in a part of the countryside where nights are darker than most people realize. There are no streetlights, no passing cars after a certain hour, and the nearest neighbor is just a shape of a house half a field away. Most nights it feels peaceful, calming in a way the city could never be, and I've grown used to the sounds of insects humming, the distant hoot of an owl, and the quiet settling of the walls when the temperature drops. My porch light casts a small circle of yellow on the wooden boards, but everything beyond that disappears into a thick kind of darkness that feels almost physical. It was the kind of quiet isolation I used to love, especially after long days when I just wanted the world to stop moving for a while. But there was one night, a night I've thought about far too often, when that silence felt like it was watching me instead of comforting me. I had stayed up late that night, reading in the living room with just a small lamp on. The rest of the house was dark, the kind of dark that makes the windows look like black mirrors. My dog, a usually calm and friendly shepherd mix, was asleep at my feet, snoring softly. Everything felt ordinary until I heard him suddenly lift his head, ears twitching. He didn't bark, which was strange for him. Instead, he just stared toward the front door with a stillness I'd never seen before. I tried to listen, but all I heard was the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. A few seconds later, he stood up completely, tail rigid, and let out a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the room. My first thought was that an animal had wandered onto the porch, a raccoon maybe, or a stray dog. But something about his posture made me pause. He looked genuinely unsettled. Just as I stepped toward the window to peek outside, a knock sounded at the front door. Not loud, not frantic, just three soft, evenly spaced taps. They were gentle enough that if the house weren't so quiet, I might have missed them entirely. My first instinct was confusion. It was almost 3 a.m. Who would come to a rural home at that hour? Delivery drivers didn't knock like that. Anyone lost would have used a phone first. And nobody I knew would show up unannounced, especially in the middle of the night. I stood at the window, but the porch was swallowed by the porch light's small glow, and I couldn't see anyone in the limited circle of illumination. The knock came again, the same soft rhythm, like someone who wasn't in a hurry. My dog pressed close to the door, still growling, nose pointed at the bottom corner as if he could smell something. I whispered his name to calm him, but even my voice sounded wrong in the stillness, too loud, too vulnerable. I considered calling out to ask who it was, but something held me back. The knock didn't feel right. There was no shift of weight on the porch, no creak of the boards that usually happened when anyone stepped up to the door. Just the sound, soft, careful, too controlled. I moved closer and looked through the peephole. Nothing. Only the porch railing and the pool of yellow light. No shadow, no movement. I leaned back, debating whether my eyes had adjusted properly when the knock came again from the side of the house. It wasn't on the door anymore. It came from the wall just to the right of it, on the part of the house where there was no porch, no walkway, nothing but overgrown shrubs and a narrow strip of dirt. The taps were the same soft rhythm, but hearing them on the siding instead of the door sent a deep wave of dread through me. No one could stand there without making noise. The brush was thick, tangled, and brittle. Yet I hadn't heard a single snap of branches, no footsteps, no shifting of leaves. My dog backed away from the door then, tail tucked, hackles raised all the way down his spine. That scared me more than the knocking. He wasn't just alert anymore, he was afraid. I wanted to turn on the porch camera app on my phone, but my hands were shaking too much. When I finally managed it, the screen didn't load properly. The image flickered with static, something I'd never seen it do before. The porch light on the feed blinked erratically, even though from inside the house I could see through the window that it was steady. The distortion on the camera felt like a warning, something outside interfering in a way I couldn't explain. And then the knocking moved again. This time it came from further along the wall, traveling slowly toward the back of the house. Tap, pause, tap, pause, tap. Like someone was moving along the siding with deliberate steps, touching the wall lightly as they passed. I stood frozen in the hallway, listening as the sound drifted toward the back door. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe someone was injured and confused, maybe someone had broken down nearby. But the way the knocks traveled made no sense. They moved too smoothly, too quietly, and always kept the same rhythm despite changing surfaces. When the sound reached the back door, it stopped completely. The silence that followed was so complete it rang in my ears. I waited for several seconds, listening for footsteps or breathing or anything at all, but there was nothing. I finally gathered the nerve to step into the kitchen and peek through the back window. The yard behind the house was pitch black, the kind of black that absorbs light rather than reflects it. For a moment I thought I saw a shape standing just beyond the line of the porch light, not moving, just there, but when I blinked it was gone. I don't know if my eyes were playing tricks on me or if something had been watching from a distance. All I know is that the quiet felt wrong in a way I hadn't experienced before. A heavy, thick, almost expectant. The rest of the night passed without another sound, but I didn't sleep. My dog stayed pressed against my leg the entire time, trembling slightly whenever the house made even the smallest natural creak. When dawn finally broke and light crept across the living room, something in me loosened just enough to move. I opened the front door and stepped onto the porch, the air cool and damp. At first glance, everything looked normal. But then I saw the prints in the soft earth near the edge of the porch, bare footprints, perfectly formed, leading toward the house. They stopped abruptly a few feet from the door, as if whoever had made them simply disappeared mid-step. There were no footprints leading away. I followed the prints around the side of the house, expecting to see more of them near the bushes where I had heard the tapping. But the ground there was untouched. No footprints, no broken branches, no disturbed soil. Nothing. And yet the memory of those careful taps on the siding stayed vivid in my mind, too precise to dismiss. I've replayed that night countless times since then, trying to make sense of how something could leave prints where no human should have stood and move silently through places that should have crackled with noise. I wish I could say it never happened again, but sometimes, when the world is dark and the house is too still, my dog will lift his head suddenly, staring toward the door with that same rigid tension. And when he does, I find myself holding my breath, listening for those soft, patient taps on the porch, wondering if the person who came that night is still walking somewhere in the darkness just beyond the light. I moved into apartment 3A at a point in my life when I needed somewhere quiet and inexpensive, a place that didn't ask much of me. The building itself was old, not falling apart, just tired in a way that felt lived in. The hallways always smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and something older beneath it, the kind of scent that clings to older buildings no matter how often they repaint the walls. My unit was small but warm, with a single window overlooking the street and a layout that felt strangely comforting. I remember thinking on my first night there that I finally had a space that felt like it could belong to me. It wasn't perfect, but it was peaceful. Or at least that's what I thought. The first night I heard the knocking, I barely registered it. It was soft, almost blending into the hum of the fridge. I was half asleep, lying on the couch because I hadn't unpacked my bed yet. When the knock came again, 3 quiet taps, I assumed it was someone visiting a neighbor. The walls in that building were thin enough to hear full conversations if people were loud. I didn't feel alarmed, just mildly curious. But as I closed my eyes again, I realized the knocking wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from the wall behind my head. At first, I brushed it off as someone hanging a picture or shifting furniture, but the knocks were too precise, too evenly spaced. And they happened again 10 minutes later, the same soft pattern, like someone tapping lightly from inside the wall. By the end of that first week, the knocking had become something I couldn't dismiss as casual noise. It always happened at night, usually between 3 and 4 a.m., and always in that same gentle, patient rhythm. Sometimes it came from the wall near the bathroom. Other times it came from the ceiling above my bed. Once, it sounded like it came from the floor by the entryway, as though someone were tapping upward with their knuckles from below. I mentioned it once to the landlord, who shrugged and said the building had odd acoustics. Pipes, probably, he said. But pipes do mimic the timing of human tapping. Pipes don't pause when you stop moving, as though listening for what you'll do next. And pipes definitely don't knock only when the rest of the building is dead silent. One night I woke up with the overwhelming feeling that someone was standing close by. You know that moment when your body reacts before your mind catches up, that silent alarm that pulls you from sleep? That's what happened. My room was completely dark except for a faint glow from the streetlight outside. I lay there listening, trying to figure out what exactly had woken me when I heard it. A single tap from somewhere near the headboard. Not loud, not sharp. Just a quiet tick against the plaster. I held my breath, listening as the tapping started again, soft and rhythmic, directly behind where my head rested. I could feel the vibration through the wood of the headboard, so faint it almost felt imagined. The sound stayed there steady, as though something was right behind the thin wall, not moving, not shifting, just tapping like it had been waiting for me to wake up. In the morning, I checked the wall. Nothing. No cracks, no signs of water damage, nothing that might explain it. Still, the unease lingered. That day, I ran into one of the older residents in the hallway, a woman who had lived in the building for decades. She asked how I was settling in, and before I could stop myself, I mentioned the knocking. The shift in her expression was subtle but immediate. Her smile faded, replaced by a tightness around her eyes. She didn't ask follow-up questions. Instead, she said quietly, "You're in 3A, right?" I nodded. "That used to be a single-unit floor," she added, glancing down the hallway as if someone might hear. "Years ago, before they renovated, it was all one big apartment, lots of hidden spaces in the walls, crawl spaces too." She paused, lowering her voice even more. "Some things echo in this building longer than they should." I tried laughing it off, but inside her words settled uncomfortably. Crawl spaces. Hidden sections of the building. It certainly explained the strange acoustics, but it didn't explain the timing. It didn't explain how the tapping always happened exactly when I was awake enough to notice but never before. It didn't explain how some nights, when I entered the bathroom, the pipes seemed to go silent right before a faint knock drifted through the wall, like something pausing mid-movement. The night that finally broke me started normally enough. I had been tossing and turning, restless from a stress-filled week. Around 3:20 a.m., just as I was drifting off, I heard tapping again, but this time it traveled. It started near the headboard, moved across the wall above my dresser, then continued toward the ceiling in slow, steady beats. The sound didn't rush or falter, as though whatever made it had all the time in the world. I sat up, heart pounding, following the path of the knocks with my eyes even though I couldn't see anything. When they reached the center of the ceiling, they stopped abruptly. The silence that fell afterward was so sudden it felt like a held breath. I thought it was over until something answered. A soft, deliberate knock responded from the far side of the room from the back of the closet. The closet door was slightly ajar, just a sliver of darkness showing. I stared at it, frozen, every nerve in my body telling me to stay perfectly still. Another tap came, slower this time, like a fingertip brushing lightly against the interior wall of the closet. I forced myself to stand, to cross the room, to close the door firmly. The tapping followed. The three soft knocks from inside the closet door, right at chest level, as if someone were standing on the other side with their forehead pressed to the wood, waiting. I barely slept the rest of the night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the hidden crawl spaces, the narrow cavities between the walls, and the idea of someone roaming through those unseen areas, following the sound of movement. The next morning, I went to the building's office under the pretense of asking about insulation, but I really just wanted confirmation that no one could access those crawl spaces anymore. The property manager looked confused. "Crawl spaces," he repeated. "This building doesn't have any, at least none that lead anywhere useful. Everything was sealed decades ago." He shrugged and added, "If there ever were openings, they're all closed off now." But that wasn't true. I knew it was. That night, long after the world outside had gone quiet, I lay in bed listening to the familiar hum of the refrigerator fade into stillness. And right around 3 a.m., as predictably as breath, a soft tap came from inside the wall next to my pillow, patient, measured, as if reminding me it had never gone anywhere. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The tapping continued for several minutes, growing slower, softer, until finally it faded into the kind of silence that feels too deliberate to be natural. I still live in apartment 3A, though I don't know why. Maybe part of me believes that leaving won't solve anything, that whatever knocks inside these walls isn't tied to the apartment but to the space itself, to the memory of something that once lived in the dark gaps of this building. Some nights, when the hour is late and the silence feels like it's pressing against the walls, I feel the faintest vibration against the bed frame. A soft, steady tap. And I wonder each time whether it's trying to get out or trying to find its way back in. Night has a way of reminding us how thin the walls of our lives really are. All it takes is a knock, soft, patient, unexpected, to make you aware of everything you don't see when the sun is up. These stories linger because they come from ordinary moments, the kind we all live through without thinking, until something presses just gently enough against the edges of our world to make us listen. When the hour is late and the world feels still, every sound carries a little farther, and every shadow settles a little deeper. That's when the quiet becomes something else entirely. If you felt a familiar heaviness while listening, that small, instinctive pause when a floorboard creaks, or when your home goes just a little too silent, you're not alone. We all have nights where the darkness feels closer than usual, where the air seems to wait for something unnamed. These stories don't chase sleep away. They simply remind us that fear often arrives quietly, like a visitor we didn't realize was already standing at the door. We share these moments because they echo something human, that need to understand the things we hear but can't explain, the things we sense but can't quite name. So as you settle back into your own night, let the quiet return on its own terms. Let the house shift, let the walls breathe, let the darkness settle the way it always does. And if you want to return for more nights like this, more stories whispered softly into the dark, you're welcome to come back. You can follow along, subscribe, or simply remember this place the next time the world feels a little too still. But for now, try to rest. Let the echoes fade, even if they don't disappear completely. And whatever you hear tonight, a creak, a tap, a soft knock in the distance, may it be nothing more than the house settling around you. Good night.